In front of hundreds of guests, CEO Cassandra Wexley pulled the employee badge from Caleb Rowan's chest, dropped it at his feet, and told him to pick it up if he still wanted a job. Grant Stroud stood at her side, smiling as the single father was called a coward who liked to play security expert. Caleb did not bend down. He only warned that within 10 minutes, every door in the tower would lock the wrong people inside. When the lights cut and Grant disappeared, the system spoke across every floor. "Welcome back, Northstar founder, Caleb Rowan. Stay until the very end to watch Caleb make every person who laughed at him go completely silent." The story began 2 days before the most important gala in Wexley Dominion's history, on a morning that looked unremarkable in every way. Caleb Rowan arrived at the executive garage at Harbor Point, wearing the same plain charcoal vest he wore every day, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a small leather notebook that most people assumed held shuttle schedules. He had been assigned to drive the backup sedan because Cassandra's regular driver called in sick that morning, a substitution that no one in the executive suite considered worth noting, because Caleb was not the kind of man anyone considered worth noting. He was quiet, unhurried, and spoke only when directly addressed, which made the leadership floor assume he was either shy or dim, and neither possibility seemed worth investigating when there were billion-dollar logistics to manage. What the garage camera recorded that morning was a man who paused at the rear door of the black sedan for exactly 4 seconds longer than necessary before he opened it, because Caleb Rowan had noticed that the wiring harness behind the interior door handle on the rear passenger side had been recently replaced. Not repaired, not patched, but cleanly swapped with a component that had no maintenance ticket attached to it. The replacement was not a sabotage attempt. The work was too careful for destruction, and the original part had been reinstalled with enough precision that any standard inspection would find nothing wrong. Someone had opened that door panel to test response time, to see how long it would take the protection team to detect unauthorized access to the principal's vehicle. Caleb filed a written incident report to Grant Stroud before Cassandra descended from the executive floor, detailing the component swap, the absence of a maintenance log, and the implication that someone with direct garage access had been probing the perimeter on a schedule no one had approved. Grant read the report in approximately 8 seconds, glanced at the door panel once without touching it, and told Caleb in front of the arriving executive assistant that the whole thing was a routine maintenance variance and that drivers were compensated to handle steering wheels, not to write intelligence novels. The dismissal was delivered with the particular kind of confidence that belongs to men who have never been wrong in a room where no one dared correct them, and it worked exactly as intended. Cassandra, already running behind for an 11 o'clock with 3 overseas investors, heard the tail end of the exchange and asked both men to hold their disagreements until after her schedule cleared. Caleb did not argue. He simply asked, in a tone so flat it barely qualified as a question, why the maintenance database entry for the sedan had been deleted exactly 17 minutes after the vehicle left the garage that morning. The question landed in the air between them, and Grant's jaw tightened for less than a second before the practiced ease returned, and he told Caleb that if he filed another unsanctioned report, he would be reassigned to overnight fleet rotation. In the elevator on the way to the conference floor, Everett Langford joined them, filling the space with his particular brand of expensive calm, talking about the autonomous transport announcement scheduled for the gala in 48 hours, a project that, if successfully launched, would lock Cassandra's operational authority over the company for the next decade. Caleb stood near the panel buttons and said nothing, but he registered that Everett asked twice about Cassandra's private exit route for the evening of the announcement, and once about whether her itinerary had been finalized with building security. That evening, in a parking structure 3 blocks from his apartment, Caleb made a brief call to his daughter, Sadie. She asked why he had taken a job where people treated him like furniture, and he told her that the most overlooked position in any room was usually the one with the clearest view of everything happening inside it. After the call, he returned to the garage security archive and found footage of a man in a maintenance uniform using a key code that belonged exclusively to Grant Stroud's administrative credentials to duplicate Cassandra's vehicle keys. Caleb went home, opened a small fireproof box on the shelf behind his daughter's spare textbooks, and removed a brushed metal card engraved with a single compass star and the words, "Founder, Northstar Shield." Caleb did not report what he had found to Cassandra directly, because direct reporting had already been intercepted once, and he had no reason to believe the second attempt would travel any farther than Grant's inbox. He spent the following morning doing what he had always done better than almost anyone in the country, pulling apart a reputation until the structural failures showed. Grant Stroud's public record was immaculate. Crisis extractions in 3 countries, a commendation from a federal protective detail, and a graduation certificate from the Northstar Shield Executive Protection Program that listed him as a distinguished finisher in the top 3 of his cohort. Every one of those credentials had been either inflated or outright fabricated, and Caleb knew this not because he had run a background check, but because he had been present for the incident that ended Grant's actual enrollment. 14 years earlier, during a live fire extraction simulation in a converted warehouse outside of Denver, Grant had abandoned his assigned perimeter position to pursue what he identified as the primary threat, leaving the simulated principal exposed for 11 minutes while he chased a decoy through the East Corridor. When the debrief came, Grant submitted a written account that transferred his positioning error onto a second trainee, altering timestamps and radio log entries with enough skill to survive a casual audit. Caleb reviewed the discrepancy personally, confirmed the falsification through 3 independent channels, and removed Grant from the program with a notation that the man was capable, motivated, and fundamentally untrustworthy in any environment where accountability mattered. What happened after that was the product of a system Caleb no longer controlled. After he left Northstar Shield, a new leadership group quietly restored Grant's file in exchange for introductions to 2 high-value clients, and the original termination record was archived behind 6 layers of access restriction that no one had reason to request. Caleb sent Cassandra a written security assessment for the gala through the company's internal compliance portal, outlining 3 specific vulnerabilities in the evacuation protocol that had been modified without an authorization signature. Grant intercepted the filing within 40 minutes, rerouted it to a dead internal address, and summoned Caleb to the security operations room on the 31st floor, where 4 members of the protection detail were present. In front of those 4 men, Grant asked Caleb if the real problem was professional jealousy. If watching a more accomplished man stand beside the CEO was simply more than a single father working a coordination job could stomach. He told Caleb that the personnel system showed no recognized security certifications in his file, no advanced training, and no qualifications that would entitle him to an opinion on executive protection strategy. Caleb looked at him for a moment and said that credentials did not protect anyone once the person carrying them had already sold the route. Grant told him one more unsanctioned communication, and he was terminated effective immediately. That same afternoon, Caleb created 3 separate itinerary documents for Cassandra's departure from the gala, one routing her north through the main entrance, one directing her to the rooftop helipad, and one guiding her through the basement service tunnel, and quietly inserted each version into the information flow of a different executive. Within 5 hours, an unregistered cargo van appeared in the service lane adjacent to the helipad and sat there for 50 minutes before moving on. Caleb contacted Laurel Knox through a numerical sequence that Alistair Wexley had given him the previous year, the kind of code that only existed because the company's founder had known something was wrong before he had proof it was. Laurel confirmed that the emergency file was still sealed and still valid, but that it could only be activated if Caleb produced direct evidence linking the internal threat to an attempt on Cassandra's authority. Caleb returned to the tower blueprint on his laptop and looked at the security architecture he had drawn himself a decade earlier, and understood that whoever had planned this had never intended to attack from outside. They intended to use the building's own protection systems to contain the one person the building was designed to keep safe. The gala occupied the entire 47th floor of Wexley Tower, a glass and steel space that had been transformed for the evening into something that looked less like a corporate event and more like the kind of gathering that appeared in financial magazines without irony. Cassandra arrived at 8 o'clock in a black evening suit, flanked by Grant in a dark jacket that fit precisely well enough to suggest it had been chosen to impress, and the room received her the way rooms full of investors always received the person who controlled their returns, with warmth that had a specific dollar amount attached to it. Everett Langford moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who had spent 50 years learning how to make other people feel that his presence was a gift, pressing hands and tilting his silver head toward each guest, as though they were the only interesting person in the building. The autonomous transport project was the centerpiece of the evening, a multi-billion-dollar logistics infrastructure that would, if it performed as promised, make Wexley Dominion the controlling architecture of commercial freight movement across the Eastern Corridor for the next 2 decades. Caleb was not supposed to be on that floor. His assignment for the evening was vehicle coordination in the garage, which placed him in exactly the right position to notice that the evacuation protocol posted on the internal security dashboard had been amended at 6:17 that evening, 90 minutes before the event began, without a supervisory signature, changing the primary exit route from the north stairwell to a freight elevator bank on the opposite end of the floor. He walked to the 47th floor through the service corridor, found Cassandra near the stage where she was 3 minutes from taking the podium, and told her quietly that the approved evacuation procedure had been replaced without authorization. Grant materialized at Cassandra's other shoulder within seconds, and before Caleb could continue, Grant told the room that Caleb had accessed restricted operational documents without clearance and produced a small data copying device that he dropped onto the table in front of the nearest guests, announcing that it had been recovered from Caleb's jacket. Everett moved toward Cassandra with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a specific cue, and suggested, with audible regret, that financial pressures sometimes caused good employees to make poor decisions. The accusation spread through the nearest circle of guests like a controlled burn, not loud, not dramatic, precisely enough contained that it reached everyone while looking like genuine concern. Grant turned to face Caleb directly and asked, in the tone of a man who had already won the argument and was simply enjoying the confirmation, whether a driver intended to instruct him on how to protect the chief executive. Caleb met his eyes and said that he had instructed him once, and that Grant had not completed the course. Grant laughed, the particular laugh of a man performing confidence for an audience, and told the room that Caleb was fabricating a connection to justify his behavior, that this kind of desperate invention was exactly what happened when someone in a low-level role convinced himself that proximity to power made him important. Cassandra had been under sustained pressure from 3 board members for 6 weeks over a separate acquisition dispute, and she had no framework in that moment for the possibility that her head of security was lying in front of witnesses and that the quiet driver beside her was not. She unclipped Caleb's employee badge from his vest, placed it on the floor between them, and told him that self-confidence was not a substitute for qualifications and that he should leave the building. Every eye in the room tracked the badge on the floor. Some of the executives near the stage smiled. Grant stood at Cassandra's shoulder with the expression of a man who had just demonstrated something important about the natural order of rooms like this. Caleb did not retrieve the badge. He said, without raising his voice, that the building was currently being staged for a false lockdown, and that if Grant executed the protocol he was planning, every innocent person in the tower would be sealed inside, while the people responsible for the situation moved freely. Cassandra instructed the security detail to remove him. 2 agents stepped forward. Caleb walked to the elevator without assistance, and as the doors began to close, he pressed the brushed metal card against the emergency and authentication terminal mounted beside the panel, a unit that had been installed during the original construction and that appeared on no current map of the building's security infrastructure. The device registered the contact in silence. 3 floors below, in a server room that had been dark for nearly 8 years, a rack of hardware that no one on the current staff knew existed began to run its startup sequence. What happened next unfolded not as a confrontation but as an architecture problem being solved from the inside. Caleb did not leave the building. He moved through the maintenance corridor on the 42nd floor, a passage he had included in the original construction, specifically because every secure facility required at least one route that did not appear in the distributed floor plan, accessible only to the person who had designed it. The Northstar card had not given him administrative control of Wexley Tower. That would have been a liability, not a feature. What it had done was confirm the 3 conditions required to activate the audit protocol that Caleb had embedded in the original system design. A lockdown order executed outside the approved chain of command, a principle removed from the designated evacuation route, and a system log deletion occurring within the same operational window. Grant had satisfied all 3 without realizing any of them were being measured. On the 47th floor, Cassandra was still at the podium when the lights shifted to emergency amber, and Grant appeared at the edge of the stage to tell the guests that a credible security threat had been identified and that evacuation procedures were being initiated. The announcement had the cadence of a rehearsed statement because it was. Within 90 seconds, the building's zone partitioning divided the tower into sealed sections. The security team assigned to the main lobby found their access cards returning errors at every stairwell door. The interior camera feeds shifted to looped footage from 6 hours earlier, and the elevator assigned to Cassandra's evacuation route began descending to a sub-level parking bay that did not appear on the public building directory. Cassandra noticed within the first 2 minutes that Grant had not contacted City Emergency Dispatch, had not communicated with the Building Operations Center, and had not used the protection protocol she had reviewed and signed off on 4 months earlier. She asked him twice and received answers that were technically coherent but structurally wrong. Too smooth, too prepared, the kind of answers that worked on audiences who were not paying close attention. The elevator reached the sublevel and the doors opened on Everett Langford, standing in a clean suit with 4 men in tactical vests who were carrying equipment that did not belong to Wexley Dominion's contracted security provider. Everett explained the situation the way powerful men explain situations they have already decided. Calmly, briefly, and as though the explanation were a courtesy rather than a demand. He needed Cassandra's biometric authorization on a single governance transfer, a temporary restructuring that would allow the company to navigate the crisis she was about to be reported missing from. He told her that Caleb had created the security failure, that the evidence was already in police hands, and that the board would have no choice but to activate the emergency succession clause the moment her disappearance was confirmed. The plan required approximately 4 hours. Enough time for Caleb to be established as the suspect, for Everett to be seated as acting chief executive, and for the governance transfer to be completed before Cassandra could contradict the official account. The biometric scanner beside Everett's associate extended toward her hand. Cassandra did not move. Then every display surface in the sublevel shifted from the Wexley Dominion corporate screensaver to a white field, and a voice that none of them recognized, steady, automated, and completely calm, announced that the lockdown sequence had been deployed outside authorized parameters and that system authority was being transferred to the originating architect. The doors holding the loyal protection detail on the 28th floor unlocked simultaneously. The elevator carrying Everett's hired team stalled between floors 31 and 32. The camera switched from looped footage to live feed. Every screen in the executive suite on the 44th floor began displaying the sublevel in real time, showing Everett Langford standing beside a biometric scanner, holding Cassandra Wexley's wrist. On the central monitor in the operations room, a personnel record appeared that no one in the current organization had ever loaded. The name on it was Caleb Rowan. Below it, in block text, Founder Authority confirmed. Caleb entered the sub-level from the maintenance access point on the west wall, carrying nothing, wearing the same plain vest he had worn at 8 that morning. Grant was still in the space, having descended behind Cassandra when the elevator engaged, and he had spent the intervening minutes recalibrating his presentation of events with the focus of someone who had been trained to adapt under pressure, which he had, though not as thoroughly as his credentials suggested. He told Caleb that whatever old access code he had recovered from a decommissioned server did not change the legal or organizational reality of the evening, and that the most likely outcome of the next hour was Caleb being charged alongside the people he was apparently attempting to frame. Caleb recited Grant's trainee identification number from the Northstar program, the exact date of his suspension, and 3 verbatim sentences from the falsified incident report that Grant had submitted 14 years earlier in the Denver warehouse. He did not say these things loudly. He said them the way a person states the coordinates of a location, precisely, without emphasis, because the facts themselves carried enough weight that embellishment would only diminish them. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds Grant Stroud's face performed a sequence of expressions that began with contempt and ended somewhere closer to recognition of a problem that had no available solution. Several members of the protection detail, who had arrived through the now unlocked stairwell doors, were standing in the doorway of the sublevel, and two of them had gone still in the particular way that people go still when they hear a name they know from something they studied rather than something they witnessed. One team leader had completed his initial executive protection certification using a methodology manual written by Caleb Rowan, though at the time of his training the author had already been absent from public professional life for several years, and the photograph on the course materials was a decade old. He lowered his sidearm to a rest position and stood straight, which was not a required or instructed response, but was the only one that felt appropriate. Cassandra looked at Caleb across the space between them and said nothing for a moment, because there was no version of the apology she needed to offer that could be delivered quickly enough to be useful right then. Caleb moved to the biometric station. Tate disconnected the portable scanner from Everett's equipment and handed it to the senior protection agent with the instruction to preserve it as evidence without cycling the power. He then told the detail to secure Everett's hired team and to keep Everett himself in the sublevel until law enforcement arrived. Grant took 2 steps toward the east service door, which had been his exit point from every operational scenario he had planned for this evening. The door did not open. Caleb looked at him once and said nothing, and then turned to Cassandra and told her that the authority in this building still belonged to the chief executive, but that she was going to need to make her next decision on the basis of what was actually true. What Cassandra learned in the hour after she was safe came in the form of a sealed file that Laurel Knox had been holding for 14 months. Alistair Wexley had begun assembling it after his oncologist gave him a timeline he chose not to share with his board. During a period when he had noticed a pattern of internal transactions that looked like preparation rather than operations, accounts being positioned, access credentials being quietly tested, governance clauses being reviewed by parties who had no current reason to review them. He had not known which member of his executive leadership was responsible, and he had understood that hiring an external investigator with a formal title would cause whoever it was to accelerate their timeline. He had reached Caleb Rowan through a mutual contact in infrastructure security, explained what he suspected without providing specifics, and asked whether Caleb would be willing to enter the organization in a low-profile role for 6 to 8 months to identify the source of the pattern. Caleb had agreed under 4 conditions: that he would not be publicly identified, that his daughter's schedule would define the outer limits of his availability, that he would have full discretion over how and when to act on what he found, and that Laurel Knox would hold a sealed file confirming his authority in the event that someone succeeded in removing him from the building before the investigation was complete. The low-profile entry was not humility, it was methodology. A recognized name would have caused Grant to perform rather than operate. A formal security title would have prompted Everett to filter every conversation. And the frank truth, which Caleb did not soften when Cassandra asked him directly, was that leaders consistently spoke without restraint in front of drivers, coordinators, and operational staff in a way they never would in front of peers. Not because those employees were invisible, but because they had been trained by repeated experience to behave as though they were. Cassandra asked why he had not revealed himself when she dismissed his first report. He told her that he had tried to submit evidence 3 separate times, through 3 different internal channels, and that each attempt had been intercepted or dismissed before it reached her, which meant that announcing his identity without supporting documentation would have produced an argument about credibility rather than a review of the evidence. Then he told her the harder thing, that the real problem was not that she had not known who he was, but that she had decided he was not worth listening to because of what she thought he was. The distinction was precise enough that Cassandra had no available response to it, which was itself a kind of answer. Laurel opened the sealed file on the conference table she had moved to from the sublevel, and the first item inside it was a short video recorded by Alistair Wexley on a Tuesday afternoon in a private office that Cassandra recognized from the particular painting on the wall behind his desk. Her father looked directly at the camera and told her, in the measured tone he used for conversations he considered important enough to preserve, that Everett had been constructing fictitious debt positions for approximately 3 years, and that Grant's credentials had been restored under circumstances that should have been investigated and were not. He said that Caleb was not coming to take anything from her, but that the question Alistair most needed answered before he ran out of time to ask it was whether his daughter had the capacity to correct errors she herself had made, including the ones that had put her in the position of trusting the wrong people. While Cassandra was reading the file, Everett had located a technical service corridor that Grant had quietly opened during the initial system configuration, a route he had kept unlocked as personal insurance against a scenario in which the plan required rapid repositioning. Everett moved from the sublevel to the 44th floor, straightened his jacket, walked into the boardroom where 4 members of the executive committee were waiting for a situation update, and told them that Cassandra had been taken by Caleb Rowan, and that an emergency succession vote needed to be held before midnight. The problem with going directly to the board was not that the evidence was insufficient. The problem was that Everett had anticipated that someone would try. He had a prepared media statement describing Caleb as a disgruntled former business owner whose company had lost a Wexley Dominion contract renewal several years earlier, a characterization that was false but that contained enough surface plausibility to function as a delay mechanism while the real record was assembled. If Cassandra appeared with Caleb and nothing else, Everett's people would describe it as a hostage situation in which the executive had been coached on what to say. Caleb outlined a different approach. Instead of announcing what they had found, they would give Everett one more opportunity to confirm it himself. Laurel sent a message to Everett's private line from Cassandra's office system, stating that Cassandra's biometric access had been temporarily suspended by the audit protocol, and that to finalize the governance transfer before the midnight deadline, Everett would need to authenticate the transaction using his personal financial authorization key, a 2-factor credential that would create a verifiable digital signature connecting his identity to each of the shell accounts involved in the scheme. Everett had not survived in high-stakes finance for 3 decades by being careless, but he had also spent 3 decades in environments where the person with the most senior title was automatically presumed to be the most reliable source in the room, and that assumption had become invisible to him the way structural failures always become invisible to the people they are most likely to destroy. He entered the authorization sequence within 11 minutes. The transaction log connected his identity to 7 shell entities that had, over the previous 31 months, transferred funds to the private security contractors who had staffed the sub-level operation, and to the intermediaries who had restored Grant's professional record after Caleb removed it. in the maintenance corridor beneath the 44th floor. Grant received an automated alert from the device he had been using to monitor Everett's communications, and understood immediately what the authentication trail meant. Everett had just created a complete and verifiable record of the scheme under his own digital signature, and the most efficient use of that record from Everett's perspective was to direct it toward Grant as the operational executor, while Everett himself occupied the position of a senior executive who had been manipulated by a compromised security contractor. Grant had been in enough difficult rooms to recognize the moment when a partner becomes a liability, and he had been in those rooms often enough to know that the person who offered information first almost always received the better outcome. He found Caleb in the maintenance corridor and surrendered a secondary phone containing 43 minutes of recorded audio, including a conversation from 6 weeks earlier in which Everett instructed him to ensure that, once the succession was complete, every documented trail in the system should terminate at the name of the driver. Everett was still presenting to the 4 board members when the boardroom door opened. Cassandra entered first, without announcement, and the room processed her presence for a moment before adjusting. Caleb followed her, wearing the same uniform from the beginning of the evening, and he was holding the employee badge that had been left on the gala floor hours earlier. Everett requested that the security team remove the unauthorized individual, which was a sentence that demonstrated with some precision how completely he had misread the last 40 minutes. No one in the room moved to comply. Laurel Knox placed a physical file on the conference table with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had been waiting a long time to do exactly this, confirmed Caleb's identity, his role in the original system design, and the terms of the emergency authority Alistair had established. The screen at the far end of the boardroom displayed Caleb's actual record. The founding documents of Northstar Shield, the architectural schematics of the Wexley Tower security infrastructure bearing his signature, the Northstar Protocol Methodology Manual with his name on the title page, the training enrollment records showing Grant Stroud as a terminated student, and a signed letter from Alistair Wexley designating Caleb as the independent auditor for the company's protection infrastructure. Several of the board members who had been at the gala and had watched the badge hit the floor now found reason to study the table surface. Caleb presented the evidence in sequence, without editorializing. The vehicle component swap and the deleted maintenance record, the 3 false itineraries, and the van that appeared at the helipad, the evacuation protocol modification without an authorization signature, the sub-level biometric coercion recorded on the building's own cameras, the shell company payment trail, the audio recording of Everett ordering Grant to terminate the evidence trail at the driver's name, and the financial authentication Everett had completed 22 minutes earlier. Everett told the room that the data had been fabricated by a man with a documented grievance against the company, that Caleb's presence in the building was itself a security violation, and that the board had an obligation to the shareholders to proceed with the succession protocol. Caleb looked at him and said that he had no interest in reclaiming something he had voluntarily walked away from, and that Everett was the only person in the room seeking a position he had never been entitled to hold. Everett demanded access to the full system record to demonstrate the falsification. Caleb told him there was one more piece of footage that no one in the room had yet reviewed, recovered from the offline server that Grant had not known existed, from a camera embedded in a ventilation panel in the sublevel 3 weeks before the gala, showing Everett and Grant walking through the space together, with Everett speaking clearly and specifically about the date, the target, and the plan to ensure that when it was over, the name attached to every piece of evidence would belong to the driver. The investigators, who had been briefed by Laurel during the previous hour, entered the boardroom from the east entrance with the paperwork already signed. Everett's expression, as they read the formal notification aloud, passed through several distinct phases before arriving at a cold and compressed stillness that was the closest he had come all evening to genuine honesty. Grant was taken into custody in the lobby, where he had been waiting with the cooperative posture of someone who understood that his calculation had shifted from escape to damage mitigation. The cooperation he had offered would be considered when his case came before a court. It would not remove the fact of what he had done to the person he had been paid to protect. Before Everett was let out, he looked at Cassandra and told her that she had handed her family's company to a man who drove a coordination vehicle for a living, and that her father would have been deeply disappointed. Cassandra waited until the sentence was complete, and then she said that Caleb had not taken anything from the company, that he had stopped people like Everett from taking it while she had been too proud to see what was directly in front of her. She picked up the employee badge from the table where Caleb had set it and held it up in front of the full board, and she told them, without hedging, that she had thrown it on the floor and called a man's competence into question in front of hundreds of witnesses, and that she had been wrong in a way that had very nearly cost her everything. The apology was not accompanied by an explanation of the pressure she had been under, or the information she had lacked, because Cassandra understood that those explanations, however accurate, were not the point. Caleb did not respond to the apology by absolving her, because absolution was not what the moment required. He said that he had never needed her to know his history in order to be treated with ordinary respect, and that the standard he was describing was not exceptional. It was the minimum the organization owed every person in it. The board voted within the hour to nullify all of Everett's governance actions and restore Cassandra's full executive authority. She offered Caleb the position of Global Security Director before the meeting adjourned. He told her he would consider it under 3 conditions, and asked whether she wanted to hear them. The first condition was that the Protection Division would be subject to independent audit on a fixed schedule, regardless of how much confidence the chief executive had in the person running it, because the entire preceding 48 hours was a demonstration of what happened when audits were skipped for people who had earned trust. The second condition was that every employee in the organization, from the logistics coordinators and building technicians to the vehicle fleet staff, would have a direct and protected channel to submit safety or compliance concerns without routing through a supervisor who might have an interest in suppressing them. The third condition was that Caleb's schedule would remain his own on the days that mattered to Sadie, because he was not willing to hold any title that required him to become an absent father a second time, and no company, regardless of what it owned or what it was worth on any given market morning, was worth that particular trade. Cassandra agreed to all 3 without negotiation, because there was nothing in any of them to negotiate. She convened a full staff meeting 2 weeks later and spoke about the evening without softening the parts that reflected poorly on her, including the specific moment, the specific words, and the specific crowd that had watched it happen. The people who had laughed at the badge on the floor were asked to watch a recording of the moment and to participate in a structured review of how that culture had been allowed to develop. Caleb did not request that anyone be dismissed over it. He drew a clear line between the people who had committed deliberate harm, the people who had participated in deliberate humiliation, and the people who had simply been silent because silence had always been the safest option in that organization. And he treated each category differently because the problem could not be solved by treating all of them the same, and because an organization that punished every form of complicity equally would only produce a more sophisticated version of the silence. In the months that followed, the security infrastructure was redesigned according to the principles Caleb had built Northstar Shield around, which held that protection failed most often not from external attack but from internal hierarchy that made honest reporting too costly to risk. Cassandra changed how she ran meetings. She began reading the first-line operational reports before the executive summaries, and she instituted a standing item in every senior session for dissenting analysis, which meant that the person most likely to be right about a problem was no longer also the person most likely to be ignored. The relationship between them developed the way things develop when both people involved have reason to be cautious, slowly, with long pauses, and with the understanding on both sides that the foundation had to be rebuilt from something more durable than the original impression. Cassandra did not find herself drawn to Caleb because of the history she had discovered or the title he now carried. She respected that he had held all of it lightly enough to set it down completely when his daughter needed a father who showed up, and that he had never once used the magnitude of what he had given up to make anyone feel small. 6 months after the gala, Cassandra stood beside the same black sedan in the Wexley Tower garage, waiting out of habit for someone to open the door, and then caught herself and reached for the handle herself. Caleb came through the building exit carrying a jacket instead of a vehicle logbook, wearing a Northstar badge beside his name where the coordination lanyard used to be, and he told her he needed to leave early because Sadie's graduation ceremony started at 2. Cassandra asked if she could come. He thought for a moment and nodded. Once, she had dropped his badge on the floor and told a room full of people that he lacked the standing to be heard. Now she understood that his standing had never been the point. The man who had built the system protecting her raised his daughter without asking for credit, and chosen presence over prestige did not need a title on a card to tell her who he was. She had known it the evening he refused to bend down, and she had simply needed the rest of the story to understand what she had already been shown.